I teach at St Joseph's Catholic College here in Swindon, and we're part of a multi-academy trust. Our cohort is around just about 1,264 students, and we have a very particular dynamic here with just under 50% of our students who have English as a second language. So for us, when we consider first of all the challenges of the Evaluate question, that particular dynamic proves for us to have a particular challenge. I think for us one of the most successful strategies is to teach students to focus on answering the question and to respond to the text. And I think that with the nature of the challenging text is really, absolutely essential for us. I think that for us, we want students to understand and build towards that understanding of what a writer is doing and how they are doing that. And I think that is challenging, but getting them to perhaps discuss those ideas verbally and ensure that we've got verbal oracy skills being embedded. And I think it's really important for us as English practitioners that despite the fact that perhaps, yes, I know we've got the spoken language accreditation, but there's no sort of particular percentage allocated to speaking and listening. It's perhaps become more crucial than ever with something like the Evaluate question. So we're experimenting at St Joseph's with debating strategies. So the lesson that I'm going to teach this afternoon, for example, starts off by asking students, which text do you like best? Text 1 or text 2? And asking them to stand up at the board, where do you stand and why, and to discuss their ability to respond with reasons, and that's Evaluate. And we're also going to ask them in group to identify which part of the description is the most powerful, the beginning, the middle or the end, and to debate and discuss that with their peers. And then finally to think about which aspect of sight is perhaps most engaging and powerful and why. And now in terms of sight, I think it is a useful framework for students to kind of hang their kind of thoughts and ideas on, and particularly if they found themselves stuck in an exam situation. And I think it's perhaps more helpful for paper 1 in relation to the unseen 19th century fictional paper, where things like settings and events are more explicit. If you think about a setting within a 19th century extract that's perhaps going to form the first part of a narrative, albeit part of a wider novel, the exam board would invariably choose something that would have an explicit setting, and then the plot, the natural nature of the plot is there. Therefore, I think sight is a useful framework. I think we have to be cautious about it as well, because I think sometimes students can perhaps detract away from the question. But I think sight is a useful, perhaps differentiated framework to guide students.
PFlow Community School is a mixed ability, comprehensive education environment. We have a full range of different abilities. Now, for us, sight gives us quite a few challenges, really. I think primarily the nature of the text doesn't actually lend itself to a lot of that piece of analysis. So when we start picking apart sight for individual texts, we found that our students were struggling primarily, I think, between the difference between what is an idea, what's a theme. So that created all kinds of problems. As an examiner, I've also noticed as well that students, when they write it, if they're being taught sight, they tend to write about settings even when there are no settings. So they tend to try to force ideas together that are not really in the text. So we looked through the exam specification, the mark schemes and all that sort of thing, and we thought, well, how can we make this work? And as a department, we decided that the one thing that was really missing was people. So we looked back through and thought, well, shall we just change it to spite and put people in? And that was an important decision, because I think when we look at 19th century texts in particular, we're looking primarily at questions like creating tension. The people are a big part in it, and when we look at the 20th century, 21st century texts, it's the people's decisions, the reasons that they're making those things happen, describing things in those ways. That's what we wanted to start looking at, to get behind the person who's writing the words, and also the effect on other people. So that's why we put person into spite. The other problem that we found, this was primarily through examining. I noticed that the best examples tend to talk about the tone in some way. So they tend to say things like, this is really effective because it creates an overall tone of a particular feeling. And so then we decided, shall we persevere with the subtle distinction between ideas and themes, or shall we just chuck it out the window and change T to tone? And that's what we decided to do. So we teach our students to do a spike analysis. We tell them that they can work in tone through any other aspect of spite. And that has led to certainly more simple and straightforward decisions for the students when they're examining the text, and that in itself lends itself to better answers.
So Thomas Riches is a selective grammar school, so for the most part we're teaching really able pupils. However, there's still a challenge around evaluation, and our main method of seeking to tackle this is to give our boys a really broad range of different types of non-fiction texts. One of the big challenges, and it's a challenge for all pupils, even those at the top end, is understanding and evaluating tone, I think. And it's also often key for pupils who perhaps are aiming for grades 8 and 9. They need to write confidently about tone. And so we've gathered together powerful, sometimes quite extreme and challenging texts, which really do sort of showcase the best work of sort of polemical and satirical writers today, very contemporary writers, and breaking that down and thinking about how that particular tone is created through certain techniques. And that's been very useful, as I say, quite a powerful tool for getting them to be able to understand tone and write confidently about it. There's still challenges remaining for us. I'm sure we're not alone in that, and we are always looking at what we're doing, making changes, tweaking. This year has been no different, but this year the key changes are coming in Key Stage 3, and we've actually really recreated our Key Stage 3 curriculum. We're always thinking about the assessment objectives, and we have spent a long time both standardising and moderating our pupils' work against assessment objectives. We map skills across language and literature for the boys all the time, so when they're doing evaluation perhaps of a non-fiction text, we remind them that they're doing the same thing with a 19th century fiction text, for example, and the boys have found that useful, and it's built their confidence. So our new Key Stage 3 curriculum is now built around 3 satellite texts in each year with an interwoven rather than a blocking structure. And the lesson progressions and common assessment tasks are all mapped against GCSE skills. So evaluation is introduced in Year 7, again in a sort of slightly stealthy way, but there all the time, almost without the boys knowing that that's what it's called in terms of having to be an exam skill they've got to get on top of.
One of the things we're still struggling with is getting students to evaluate. So although we can get them to focus on the setting, the tone, the people, turning that from just a piece of analysis into evaluation is what we're currently working on, and trying to work out how students start their sentences. Now, what I've done is I've jotted down a list of acronyms that people use. These are from marking. So this is how lots of people are doing it. Grandpa, BME, sick, mice nest, peed, petal, site, ties, me site, pecs. Now presumably all of these are designed in some way to help students evaluate. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter which one we use, as long as we are fairly consistent in the way we approach it in our school. But it is a real struggle to work out whether putting the word cleverly into a sentence actually does mean you're evaluating, or whether you are actually just dropping a word in. Does that semantic change actually have a substantial change? And I think that's where we're working at the moment.